It's time for Recipe of the Day. I hope you're having a beautifully relaxing Sunday. I'm planning to go for a nice walk in the cool air. It is actually supposed to be cool this weekend here in Florida. Fingers crossed. Not that I'm going to complain if it's not. I know that it's much colder and harder to deal with in other parts of the continent than here. So whatever weather you're having, I hope you're finding a way to enjoy it. I will as well. I will also be doing something with some dried mushrooms. So today's recipe of the day is not so much of a recipe as a how-to, and it's all about how to use dried mushrooms. And I'm telling you about that now because one of my favorite recipes for the holidays is the Ukrainian creamy mushroom sauce that we have on our pierogies on Ukrainian Christmas Eve. It is such a wonderful treat. That's the meatless dinner that we do. So there's fish, and then anything else that we're having doesn't have any kind of meat in it. And so this mushroom sauce ends up being kind of a star of the show. It goes on the pierogies. I also put it on the cabbage rolls and on my fish, and then use the nice bread to soak it up. So it is an important part of the meal, and I tend to be doing a lot of things with dried mushrooms this time of the year. So I'm going to give you some tips and tell you what I do with them. So first, what kind of dried mushrooms to buy? At my grocery store, there aren't very many kinds, and the ones that I tend to buy are the porcini. The morels are fine. I like them. Sadly, the chanterelles never seem to have very much flavor, and I just don't even bother with those. The shiitake mushrooms, you can get them sometimes at the Asian market in big bags. Sometimes my grocery store has them. My grocery store always has the fresh shiitake as well, so I don't tend to get those, but I have bought that big bag when I'm at an Asian market, and then there's just always these handy dried mushrooms in the pantry. You know what I mean? So once you get your dried mushrooms, you should store them in a cool, dark place in their sealed container that they came in, so probably like in your pantry, and they will last with beautiful, full flavor, dried and stored like that for 6 to 12 months. After that, their flavor starts to diminish, but you can still use them for another year. They're totally edible. Once you rehydrate the mushrooms, though, you really do need to use them immediately. That's when they're at their best. If you do soak them and then you want to store them in an airtight container in the fridge, they'll be okay for 1 to 2 days. And the liquid that you hydrated them in, which is honestly the reason that I love dried mushrooms, I'm going to talk about this more in just a second, that liquid, you can store that for 4 to 6 days. And yeah, I'm going to just say this here. I love fresh mushrooms. I use them in all kinds of things. I don't even really see a need for dried mushrooms most of the time, except you get this glorious, wonderful liquid from them when you soak them. So the way that you use dried mushrooms, most typically, I mean, there's things people do where they put the dried mushrooms in coffee grinders and use them as coatings for things. I don't do that. What I usually do is put them into a measuring cup or bowl, and then I add 1 cup of boiling water per ounce of dried mushrooms, give them a stir, and then leave them there for 30 minutes, stirring every now and then because they kind of float. You want to make sure that they're all kind of evenly getting in that water. After that, you're going to drain them. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But that liquid is amazing. I add it to all kinds of gravies and things and let it kind of simmer away and intensify. It brings so much mushroom flavor into recipes. If you're doing any kind of mushroom risotto or just anything where you want the mushrooms to really shine, you can do the fresh mushrooms, but also do some of these dried ones just to get that liquid. Okay, so I told you how to rehydrate them. It's 1 cup of boiled water to 1 ounce of dried mushrooms for 30 minutes. And then you need to strain them. So first of all, whatever you're going to do, make sure you're putting a bowl under your strainer or under your fine mesh sieve. You do not want to pour this straight down the drain. Then you've lost that liquid gold, that wonderful mushroom liquid, right? So set a fine mesh sieve into a bowl, and then I just pour it into there. A lot of people recommend that you use a paper towel in that sieve or a coffee filter or a cheesecloth because there could be grit on those mushrooms and you don't want it. But I find that quite often whatever I use as a liner, either it takes forever for the liquid to get through it, or that absorbs a lot of the liquid, and so I don't get all of it. And so I have decided that I would prefer to have just that little bit of grit that may end up at the bottom. It's just like little bits of mushroom dust, really. I prefer to have a little bit of that than to lose all of my liquid. Also, once you do strain that through, that grit tends to settle to the bottom. So if you're just paying attention and you just pour and like stop, leaving like a teaspoon or so at the bottom, you're probably going to skip that grit. If you are worried about it, line your sieve with the coffee filter colander or paper towel or cheesecloth and pour through there, and you will be fine. Okay, after you've strained the mushrooms, now you have the liquid. Don't discard it. Keep it nice and safe, but you do want to rinse the mushrooms. They will have some of that grit on those as well, so give them a quick rinse, and then I usually roughly chop them. I find these rehydrated mushrooms to be, well, let's just say a bit slimy, and so it's best if you have small pieces of them. So give them a chop. Now, once they've been soaked and strained and rinsed and chopped, you do have to cook them. It's best to saute them in some butter or olive oil. You can add them to some fresh mushrooms that you've already sauteed and then add these in and saute them for another few minutes. That will work just fine. And I will say what I typically do is I'll saute my fresh mushrooms while the dried mushrooms are hydrating. And then once they're done hydrating and I've drained them, reserving the liquid, rinsing them, chopping them, I add them in with the fresh mushroom, saute for a few more minutes, and then that's when I add that mushroom liquid into there, and then I cook kind of on high heat, letting that evaporate away and concentrate, and then I use that as the basis for my sauce, or really almost any recipe that I'm going to do. That is going to be the base. The only exception, I guess, would be if I was going to make risotto, then I would probably take the mushrooms off of the stove and then like saute a little bit of onion, add in my arborio rice, and then the little bit of wine that you start with. And then probably my first addition of liquid to that risotto would be the mushroom liquid, making sure that I use it all and it gets used. And then I would start adding the hot broth that doesn't have the mushroom liquid. I could have just mixed the mushroom liquid with the broth, but then you risk not needing it all, and then you've lost some of that mushroom broth mixed with the other broth. You see what I mean? It's very important to use all of this very delicious liquid, you know? The last thing that I'll talk about before I sign off here is if you can substitute dried mushrooms for fresh. It is certainly handy to have those dried mushrooms in the pantry, and then you could just grab them and use them whenever you want instead of having the fresh mushrooms, having to keep them fresh in your fridge, you know? So I have researched this, and I have found a lot of people saying that you can substitute one for the other. It's 3 ounces of dried mushrooms for 1 pound of fresh mushrooms. This is under the assumption that you're going to slice and saute those fresh mushrooms. So you imagine a recipe calls for 1 pound of fresh mushrooms that you're slicing and sauteing. You would use 3 ounces of the dried mushrooms that you fully rehydrate, drain, chop, and then saute. Okay, so that's how that conversion works. I'm just going to say I find that fresh mushrooms and dried mushrooms are very, very different from each other. They have different flavor. The dried mushrooms are a little stronger or earthier. They're also wetter, and they don't seem the same as sauteed mushrooms to me. So I would never really substitute one for the other. Like I was telling you, I tend to use them in conjunction with each other. Saute the fresh, then add the rehydrated dried. So that's what I do. But that is the substitution there if you want to do it that way. Okay, I think that is all that I have to say about using dried mushrooms. If you haven't tried them before, look for them at the store, grab a packet of those porcini. Those are my favorite, and give it a try. I think you're going to be in for such a treat. I will put the link to this recipe in the show notes for this podcast episode, or you can head to cookthestory.com/ROTD and get it there, or find it in our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/recipeotd. And hey, just a quick note. I'm on a recording hiatus right now, so for the next little while, I'm replaying episodes from the archives, including this one. If you heard me mention a holiday, a season, or something going on in my life that seemed a bit off, that's why. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you're enjoying these older episodes. I am Christine Pittman from cookthestory.com, thecookful.com, cookfor2.us, and from this podcast, Recipe of the Day. I hope you have a great day. Let's get cooking.